Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. We are here to discuss the book Indira Gandhi and the Years That Transformed India, written by Professor Srinath Raghavan. Indira Gandhi was, of course, one of the most consequential figures in the history of independent India. Barring a brief interlude, she was in power from 1966 till her assassination in 1984. And during this time, she oversaw several transformative and controversial events in India, including the breakup of Congress, bank nationalization, Bangladesh war, the emergency, most important of all, the Operation Blue Star, and many more. And I think a lesser biography than this would perhaps cataloged all those events and try to unpack the motivations of various actors that were involved, which would have been a mean feat in itself. But this book, I think, tries to do so much more. It tries to really use Indira Gandhi as a vehicle to explain the deeper structural changes that are happening in India at the time. It's a book that really tries to tell you, I think, the political system that was created in 1940s and 50s, how that collapses in 60s and then is transformed into something else, something that we know today as the political system, the India of today. That political system comes about. And the term that I think Srinath uses is the hinge that really changes, on which the history of India turns during the long 1970s, as they call it, from mid-1960s to mid-1980s. And I think this book not only enriches our understanding of India's past, but also, of course, India's present, because there are so deep similarities between what happened in 1970s and what has been happening in India in the last 15 years. I know that you talk in the book that you don't want to traffic in historical parallels or historical lessons, but it's impossible not to see many of those events which happened in 1970s sort of playing out beat by beat again in the recent times. And the similarity has, to a certain degree, also discrepancies between the two periods. There's one particular praise that I would want to heap among many on this book, which is that I think beyond just good history, it's good literature. I think that I really enjoyed reading it because the language is crisp and witty in a way that you don't usually find in history books. And some of the metaphors and turns of phrases that you use were really delightful. So I would tell you that just read it for fun, if for nothing else, this book. Given all of the virtues of this book, we are really fortunate that we have Srinath Raghavan here with us today, the author of the book, who is Professor of History and International Relations in Ashoka University and senior visiting fellow, now a senior visiting fellow at Center on Globalization and Asia and Globalization at the LKY School. So welcome to Singapore, Srinath. He's one of the, if you do not know already, he's one of the most respected historians working in India today. And among his many works are definitive histories of the 1971 war, India in Second World War, and American foreign policy in South Asia through the period. So Srinath, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandeep. I think maybe it would have been better to leave you all with the impression of the book that he has given you, rather than proceed to inflict something slightly different. But thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about all of this. And this is my first sort of visit here. I'm relatively new to Singapore, at least in an academic setting. So it's nice to see some familiar faces and get to know others. And thanks to all of you for coming here on what I'm sure is a busy Wednesday afternoon for everyone. So this book was published just around the time when I moved to Singapore, which is about 6 odd weeks ago. And, the publication of the book coincided with the 50th anniversary of the imposition of the emergency in June 1975, which, as Sandeep quite rightly said, is perhaps the one thing with which Indira Gandhi is still in both popular memory and otherwise, not just in India, but in many other places associated with. And I felt that publication of the book to coincide with that anniversary was not something that either certainly I had not planned for, but it just so happened that the timings worked out. But it's also a bit of an irony, because one of the central things that I wanted to do with this book was actually to shift focus away from an exclusive sort of preoccupation with the emergency itself. And, I think it's partly the passage of time. We're talking about 50 years, but already around the 40th anniversary of the emergency, I remember we had a couple of good books which came out on the emergency, by historians, political scientists, others. There's still a lot of memoirs and other kinds of evaluative literature on the emergency which gets published. But what I felt, throughout that time, which is more or less the time in which I've been working on this book over the past decade or so, was that an somewhat exclusive preoccupation with the emergency tends to distort both our understanding of the emergency itself, but also of what that period really was about and how we should understand it as a historically delimited, period of time. So what I really wanted to do was to actually write a political history of India in what is I call the long 1970s in this book. That period also happens to coincide with the sort of Indira Gandhi's ascendance and her period of domination in Indian politics, whether in or out of power. So in a sense, this book is about Indira Gandhi, but it is more importantly also about the period and the various kinds of historical changes that happened. So my task was, as I saw it, really to first identify what those salient sort of changes were, and then to try and give as coherent an explanation as I could for how do we understand what happened then, and then think about what the consequences of all of that would be. So the emergency then becomes an central episode. There are 2 chapters of the book which deal with the period of the emergency in this. So it's not to minimize the importance of the emergency, but to try and situate it in a more firmly historical context, and then try and understand what it really amounted to, right? So let me just begin by laying out a few of the pieces of what I think are the kind of ways in which I have learned to see this period, and what I think are good ways of trying to explain what happened. And then we can open up for a discussion. So the long 1970s is a phrase that I have not invented. It's ever since Eric Hobsbawm, people have been calling long and short for various time periods. So historians are all guilty of these kinds of devices, but it is a useful device in a sense that it helps at least me think about this as a unified period, which was a period of transition and change from one kind of a sort of, political system broadly defined, which, for shorthand, you could call Nehruvian India. Gyanesh Kudesia is here. He has written about the long 1950s and so on. So how do we get from that kind of a political system, which is dominated by the Congress Party, which has a certain kind of an economic orientation, which is planned economic development to foster a mixed economy, with an international orientation, which is predominantly about non-alignment and strategic autonomy, to the India in which we have been living for the last 30 odd years, where it is initially, at least in the 1990s, was a coalition system, which came to be dominated by another hegemonic party, now the BJP, to an economic order, which is much more dominated by the private sector and is globally integrated, to an international kind of position, which is actually much closer to countries like the United States, with whom we were making or attempting to be equidistant back in the day of the Cold War, right? So my interest was to understand how did we get from that to this. And it is in that sense that I think about the long 1970s. But as I said, I'm not the only one who was thinking about this period in this way. And the long 1970s is, I think, a very interesting sort of phase in the global history of the 20th century itself. If you look at the broader global historiography within which I try to situate what was happening in India, you would see this period as marked by, an upsurge of popular, especially student-led protests in the late 1960s, call it Global 1968 for shorthand. It also included protests against the Vietnam War, etc. The advent of a new sort of sets of agents on global politics, which is youth, through to the major, massive changes which happened to the global economic system in the early 1970s. And again, there are many contributors to it, but I think 3 things are important to note. The first is the United States' decision to undo the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. Very important. The second thing which happened around the same time is a kind of long slowdown in terms of productivity in advanced Western economies. Robert Brenner has kind of explained that. And the third thing is the international oil and energy shocks coming out of the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. But there was a second major oil shock in 1979, which happens as a result of the Iranian Revolution. And between these kinds of major disruptions, the global economy is really in a period of major flux and turmoil, as a result of which many of the older ideas of economic policy management, what you would, for a shorthand, think of as Keynesian kind of policies, give way to a new set of ideas, which we today broadly call neoliberal, etc. And then the ascendancy of the neoliberal period is what is the finishing point of the long 1970s, right? And then you can see the story playing out in a range of contexts. In fact, there's been a very interesting book recently on China in pretty much the long 1970s by two great historians of China, Ani Westad and Chen Jian, which in a sense is a parallel kind of an account of the kinds of changes that happened from the Cultural Revolution onwards in China towards reform and opening up, right? So in a sense, the storyline that I am trying to sort of adopt here is therefore not something which is exclusively Indian. And that I think is the first important thing we need to bear in mind. Because when we situate what happened in India, including things like the emergency in this broad context, what we realize is that liberal democracies everywhere were on their ropes in the 1970s. In the 1970s, precisely because of this kind of period of energy economic crisis coming together, rise of new kinds of social actors, established democratic governments everywhere were struggling. In fact, you could think of thinkers from the sort of liberal left to all the way to the right, people like, say, Habermas to Huntington, who were all writing about something called a crisis of governance and of legitimation in the 1970s, because that was the main problem. And that was a problem that India also faced, right? So that is the broad framework within which I wanted to present the story. And throughout the book, I emphasize how at various points of time in the Indian story of the long 1970s, these kinds of global pressures converged and created issues. I mean, whether it is the story of the onset of the emergency, or even of the sort of return of Indira Gandhi to power in this thing. The global oil shocks were a very important part. I mean, few of us remember today, but in 1979, the Indian economy, because of the Iranian oil shock, actually had negative 5% GDP growth. It is the sharpest contraction of the Indian economy in the 20th century. That was one of the major reasons that the Janata government kind of was seen as totally ineffectual and this thing, apart from all the other political dramas which were playing out at that time. So I think it's very important for us, therefore, to relate what was happening in India to this kind of a global conjuncture. Yeah. Now, what is the Indian story? As I see it, the Indian story is, from the period of, say, about 1966 to 1984. The beginning of the period 1966, I argue 1966-67, you could say, with the fourth general elections, where the Congress party actually just about manages to hold on to its majority, loses a number of very important states. So the onset of this period, I think, is marked by not simply a crisis of the Congress party, but what I think are a set of three different crises, at least analytically, which we can separate out, which is what someone like Indira Gandhi and the political system more broadly faced. And whatever happened thereafter is effectively a response to these three sets of problems. So the first is what I would think of as a crisis of hegemony or a crisis of legitimation, right? The political system as a whole was facing a challenge of legitimation. And that challenge was coming up because much of that system in the preceding period, in the so-called Nehruvian period, was actually, at least in some material sense, drew its ability to sort of get the consent of the people, principally on claims of planned economic development, right? And by 1966-67, it is very clear that that planning apparatus as a whole has broken down almost irrevocably, right? In fact, the fourth plan is put on a hold. The planning commission is dissolved. There's a planned holiday which is declared, right? All of which are acceptance by the government that, listen, this particular thing needs to be rethought in very significant ways, right? So the second thing which happens around the same time is the sort of, a rise of other forms of social revolt against the political system as a whole, of which I think Naxalbari is a very good sort of indication of the kinds of problems of legitimation that the system is facing. So there's a crisis of hegemony, right, in 1966-67. The second, and all of these are related, the second one is what I describe as a crisis of representation. And that in some ways is the problem of the Congress Party. The Congress Party from its very inception called itself the Indian National Congress. And the claim from the very beginning, from the late 19th century, was that this is a party which spoke for the nation as a whole. And particularly in the period after the creation of Pakistan, when the Muslim League ceased to be an important player in Indian politics, the Congress Party's ability to actually claim to speak for various kinds of strata and segments of Indian society had a degree of plausibility. And the Congress Party actually dominates Indian politics at every level, national, state level, local level, right? That is what Rajni Kothari and others described as a one-party dominant system, right? And that one-party dominant system was because of the Congress Party's ability to represent interests at various levels of Indian politics. And what the 1967 elections show is that the Congress Party just about manages to keep its majority in Parliament, Lok Sabha, but loses control of several important states in North India and the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu. Yeah. So, and they have never ever come back to power, at least in Tamil Nadu since then. Right. And that happens because there are a number of new social actors, particularly from the backward castes, political parties which are representing new interests, which are capable of thinking more tactically and about how to sort of form alliances in order to take on the Congress's dominance and how to make the first past the post system work in ways that do not always work to the advantage of the Congress Party, right? So the Congress Party is therefore ability, it's still in power, but its real claims to be able to represent interests of various kinds of social groups within the Indian context is, there's a big question mark around that. And there is a big question mark around who will do that sort of job of overcoming this crisis of representation if it is not going to be the Congress Party, right? So you have the crisis of hegemony or legitimation, you had a crisis of representation. And the third related aspect to it is the crisis of governance, right? And the crisis of governance, as I said, you could see it in the context of economic policy making, but there is a broader sets of problems coming out of war, out of, the fact that you had 2 years of consecutive drought in 1964, 65, 66, and all of which meant that the entire sort of apparatus of governance, etc., seemed to be sort of balancing on the brink. Right now, it is in this context really that Indira Gandhi comes to power, and it is these sets of challenges that she and the political system have to face. And what I argue in the book, and I don't want to get into too many details, so let me just give you the outline. What I argue in the book is that in response to these three crises of the sort of which the Indian political system confronts, you had three major sets of changes which happened over the course of the long 1970s, right? They did not happen immediately, but they happened over a period of time. And in retrospect, we can recognize these as more or less important, lasting changes to the way that Indian politics and political economy operated. So the first of these is the sort of what I describe as a transformation of the Indian political system itself, right? The second is the rise of a new mode of doing politics, which Indira Gandhi particularly is important in inaugurating from about 1969 when she breaks the Congress Party, which I describe as a Caesarist mode. We can get into what that means, but basically it's an attempt to move beyond institutional structures of doing politics, including electoral politics, which is to say through party, parliament, etc., by crafting a much more direct popular appeal to the electorate itself. And the third is a very important set of changes in Indian political economy, particularly in the way that the Indian state conceived of development and what the challenge of development was. And secondly, the relationship between what you would think of as the state and the economy, right? So those were the three broad sets of, I think, transformations which happened over the long 1970s in response to the kinds of crises that we see right at the beginning of these. So let me just, in brief, just try and explain what each of these mean and how I think those changes came about, right? So let's start with the story of the transformation of Indian political system as a whole. Now, when I say transformation of the political system, what do I mean? I think when we think about it systemically, you could say that all political systems have at least two related characteristics, which are, you may say, systemic in a sense that they affect the system as a whole. They affect all actors within a system. And they are not only about this or that actor, right? I mean, there were lots of things that changed in Indian politics. As I said, there were rise of new parties, right? I mean, like you had parties led by people like Chaudhry Charan Singh in North India, right? Which gave the intermediate castes, the Jats and others. There were other kinds of backward castes which kind of started coming together in the Janata period as this thing, right? So there are many changes in terms of political actors. The DMK comes to power in Tamil Nadu. But when I say systemic change, I do not mean simply a change in terms of the composition of the people, but in terms of the character of the system as a whole, right? So as I said, two attributes are important, and we see very important changes happening in both those sets of attributes. The first attribute of every political system is the differentiation between different parts of the system in terms of functions and powers, right? Now, in parliamentary systems, we tend to think of it as a separation of powers or functions between the executive, legislature, and the judiciary, right? Each branch of government has its own particular remit. It has certain functions and it has certain powers, right? Some of this is put down in constitutions, but often there are a range of other kinds of informal understandings which are developed, which are very important to keep any such system going. Yeah, only constitutions and letter of the law alone will not kind of make such a system work, right? In particular, you need to have one quality, which I think most commentators on democratic politics point out, is a degree of self-restraint on the part of all actors, because that is what actually allows a system like this to function, which has differentiation in terms of separation of powers and this thing, right? Now, this kind of a system of the separation of powers by 1974 transforms into one of almost complete dominance of the executive branch of the government, right? And that, I think, is the first most important change which happens within the political system, right? Now, how does that change happen? It happens because in the first instance, the executive becomes powerful because Indira Gandhi, who is the prime minister of the country, decides to break her own party. So what is left of the Congress party, which is with her, which is the majority of the party, is actually beholden to the prime minister in a way that was not true even of the Congress party under Jawaharlal Nehru. And I think that's a very important point to understand. I mean, just imagine what happened to someone like Boris Johnson. Why did Boris Johnson get turfed out as prime minister? It is because a conservative parliamentary party actually sort of voted against him. So the party in parliament is actually a very important source of a subtle check on the chief executive. And with the sort of breakup of the Congress party, Indira Gandhi actually managed to get a party which was much more subordinated to her than the previous Congress party was, right? And that level of subordination is cemented through her remarkable victory in the 1971 general election, which she calls 1 year ahead of time. It's a gamble, but it works. Yeah, nobody could have assured that, especially after what happened in 1967. Yeah, the Congress party goes from 283 seats to about 353. And this is a party which she has herself broken. And then you have the Bangladesh crisis of 1971, which comes up a few months after this massive electoral victory, in which India wins its most spectacular military victory on Pakistan, right? All of which means that when the state elections come up in 1972, the Congress party basically takes back all the states that it has lost, except for Tamil Nadu and a few others. So by 1972, you have a situation where the executive has more or less full control over the parliament, including state legislatures, which means that all kinds of constitutional amendments can be brought because some of them have threshold requirements of state legislature ratification as well. That executive is not really bound to parliamentary pressures in any serious way. And more importantly, even people in the cabinet who in a cabinet system of government are all basically subordinate. In fact, there's a very interesting note prepared by P.N. Huxer, who is Indira Gandhi's principal secretary, soon after the 1971 election. He says, hereafter, everyone sitting around the table from you has to justify their position on the table. Yeah, there is an immediate shift in terms of balance of power. And what that means is that from 1971, not only is Indira Gandhi sort of strengthening her position vis-a-vis parliament, her party, and within the government, but she also decides to go after the judiciary, with whom she has had running sort of battles over various kinds of things, especially over questions of whether parliament can amend the constitution in certain ways that would affect particularly fundamental right of property, right? And Indira Gandhi sort of because of the shifting balance of power, is able to tame the judiciary by replacing the Chief Justice with her own appointee. Right? Two senior-most judges of the Supreme Court are superseded in 1973, which then means that the new Supreme Court effectively is an institution which is willing to go along with the executive on a range of things. Yeah, now, that doesn't mean problems go away, but so the institutional balance of power has shifted fundamentally by 1974. And I think that's the first aspect of the thing. But that is not the only story of what is changing in Indian politics, even in a political system kind of way. Because what also starts changing from 1967 is another systemic sort of system-wide property of Indian politics, which is what you would think of as the rules of the game of how parliamentary politics is supposed to operate. Yeah. Every political system operates not simply on the basis of constitutions, but of rules, norms, procedures, precedents, various kinds of practices that are seen as perhaps permissible in theory, but not in practice, right? For instance, in British parliamentary politics, there are very few people in the late 19th and early 20th century who would have actually left their party and, as they say, crossed the floor and joined someone else. The exception which proves the rule is Winston Churchill, who actually did it twice, right? And he was always seen as something of an outlier in British politics because of that. Yeah. But from 1967, Indian parliamentary politics is all about horse trading, because the opposition has to kind of pull together various forms of coalition governments at the level of the state. And the central sort of Congress party's only interest is to destabilize those governments. So what you have is a competitive sort of undermining of these kinds of rules of the game, making and breaking of various kinds of governments, all of which we take as very much given in Indian politics today. But that itself is an index of how much changed in that very short period, that we have totally normalized and think that this is the way that this thing runs, right? I mean, bringing down of a government in Maharashtra is seen as a masterstroke by this thing, right? I mean, nobody would use terminology like that back in the day because that was seen as not acceptable practice. Nowadays, it's common, right? That's because of the changes which have happened. So that's part of the reason why I'm a little wary of making comparisons, is because we are living with the consequences of the changes which have happened, right? So it's tough to compare things when they are internally linked in this way to each other. So I think, we have to understand that Indian politics is where it is today because of those changes which happened then. So it's tough to somewhat compare things when they're endogenously linked to each other as variables, right? Okay. So, and this is a story that this kind of undermining of politics and various kinds of rules of the game, as I call it, becomes even more after 1972. Because what happens after 1972 is that the parliamentary opposition, especially after the 1971 general elections and the 1972 state elections, really is on the ropes. They felt that 1967 onwards, the system had become competitive. They could actually put the Congress party in its place, put a lot of, be more competitive in the game. But then they realized that, suddenly after this kind of 1971-72 sort of turn, things are looking much grimmer. And from 1972 is also the period when you have the crisis of the global economy starting to impact on the Indian economy, right? So you have inflation going up from the period from 1972 to 74 in a very significant way, right? And that in some ways is the first trigger for various forms of student protests, which happened in Gujarat and then subsequently in Bihar. And it's a movement that is then comes under the leadership of Jayaprakash Narayan, right? But all along, political parties in the opposition see that now there is an opportunity that if we cannot defeat the Congress party in elections, which looks very difficult, then here is another way of putting pressure, right? So they managed to get the Congress government in Gujarat to resign. And the Gujarat Assembly is put in suspension. And a similar demand is made as far as Bihar is concerned. So there is a lot of what is, even at that point of time, called extra parliamentary politics, which comes into play, right? And this is, you can see, across the political spectrum, from the CPM on the left to the Bharatiya Janata Sangh on the right. Political parties are quite clear in saying that, listen, there is no point in playing by the rules of parliamentary politics alone. That then consigns us to a very, very sort of weak position. So it is better that we don't. But once you do it, then it gives a handle to the government as well to then not play by any rules, right? And then, so this change, which happens again by 1974, right? By 1974, between 1967 and 1974, you have a political system where there is a shift in terms of the balance of power, and there is a shift in terms of the rules of the game. And I think these two changes are absolutely important to understand how the emergency actually happens. Yeah. Why do I say that? Because, whenever we talk about saying, why did the emergency happen? We immediately lapse into the question of saying, why did Indira Gandhi impose emergency? Yeah, which is a fair enough question. And I think it's a question we should ask. She herself gave some answers saying that she felt there was a great internal security threat to the country. There were various kinds of forces at work, etc. I do not believe that any of those were true. I think those are all sort of various kinds of excuses which were trotted out. Her concern was to hold on to her office, which was threatened by a High Court verdict against her election in 1971, given by the Allahabad High Court in June 1975. Her reason was very much to hold on to power. But we cannot understand something like how the emergency happened simply by asking the question of what Indira Gandhi wanted to do in imposing the emergency. Because at the end of the day, you had a political system which was configured precisely to be the opposite of what the emergency regime was. There were emergency powers in parliament, but they could not be so in the constitution, but they could not simply be invoked by the executive at this thing, right? In fact, even if you look at the way in which Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed signs the emergency decree, he does away with all the minimum safeguards which are there in the constitution itself. For instance, there is a requirement that there should be a written recommendation from the cabinet before an emergency is promulgation is given up. It is interesting to note that there was an emergency declared in 1971 when the war with Pakistan happened. And even at the time, when India was at war with Pakistan, the cabinet met, a recommendation was sent to the president, then a promulgation is issued. Whereas here, at the dead of night, Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed signs off on a sheet of paper, which is brought to him by a functionary of the prime minister. She calls a cabinet meeting next morning at 6 a.m. Yeah. That is, of course, again, a result of the kind of changes that I described, right? So if we want to understand not so much why did Indira Gandhi impose the emergency, but how did a political system which actually is based on various kinds of checks and balances end up sliding so easily into this form of authoritarian rule, then I think we need to understand the antecedent changes which had already happened, the changes in the balance of power and changes in the rules of the game. So which is why I believe that it is very important for us not to just be focused on what Indira Gandhi is doing, but how is it that she was actually able to accomplish this kind of a move, right? And this continues through the period of the long 1970s and beyond. Even in coalition governments, including starting with the Janata government, which is a coalition government, to all subsequent coalition governments, you will find that the prime minister and the executive is actually very strong, unless their majority in parliament is so weak that they can be sort of put under pressure very easily, which has happened in a few occasions. But even not. I mean, like, for instance, the current government is not a majority government. But is there any doubt about the authority of the prime minister? There isn't any, right? And that is because those things have changed quite a while ago. The office of the prime minister is able to arrogate a lot of powers to itself, even in normal times. You don't need, individual personalities can accentuate those effects, but you don't only need a Narendra Modi to sort of have this kind of thing. Atal Bihari Vajpayee used to happen. Even Manmohan Singh, who people think of as a weak prime minister. I think those are all, ways in which we tend to confuse what a personality and a position of power actually mean, right? I mean, those are two different things. Similarly, the rules of the game actually never ever were taken seriously, even by the Janata government when it was formed. Right? See, when the elections are called after the emergency, Indira Gandhi loses, the opposition comes to power. The Janata government, I think, is very focused on doing one thing which was very important, which was to undo some of the worst constitutional changes which were done during the emergency. Yeah, which were all there to make sure that the executive is kind of fireproof against various kinds of things and so on. So they, in order to undo the effects of the 42nd Amendment to the Indian Constitution, they bring in the 44th Amendment, which is very important. But what the Janata government is not able to recognize is that simply bringing constitutional changes is not going to solve the problem. A lot of your crisis is also because the rules of the game are not being followed. And they themselves are entirely oblivious to their own role in the way that these rules of the game have been eroded over the preceding period, right? And as a result, things continue. For instance, there's a very interesting thing which happens, which again, we don't tend to remember very long. The March 1977, the elections happen. The Janata government is formed. Morarji Desai becomes prime minister. Within 6 weeks, they decide that they do not have a majority in the Rajya Sabha, as a result of which they are not able to bring in constitutional amendments. So they say that all state governments, which have Congress governments, are going to be dismissed, because they claim that you do not have any legitimacy because your party has lost terribly in the general election. So why are you sitting in office, right? So a move is made. A bunch of those states go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually upholds what the government wants. And as a result, all of those Congress state governments are cashed ahead of their tenure, right? Fast forward to 1980, when Indira Gandhi comes back to power, that's the first thing she does. She dismisses all the Janata state governments. And again, the Supreme Court sort of upholds all of that stuff, right? So what you see, therefore, is a continuation of a derogation of norms, of understanding that rules of the game matter in certain kind of ways. And as I said, today, it is all so normalized in Indian politics that my explaining that somehow things were different itself seems like, why are we talking about some very highly idealistic picture? Yeah, that itself is an index of the change. Okay, so this is the first sort of broad change in Indian politics. This is one of the major themes of the book, is about how the Indian political system actually underwent this change. And again, I do not want to try and present a highly sanitized and whitewashed picture of what the Nehruvian period, etc., was. Right? Many of these things started. We know about the dismissal of the Kerala government, of the communist government by Jawaharlal Nehru, etc. So it is not there. But this level of systemic prominence of these kinds of shifts is very much a product of the long 1970s. So that's the first big sort of story that the book tries to tell. And again, a lot of the crises that Indira Gandhi confronts in the 1980s, particularly in Punjab, Assam, Jammu and Kashmir, which are the three major sort of areas, which also leads to her tragic assassination in 1984, are all a consequence of the kinds of antecedent changes which have happened in terms of extensive concentration of power in the central government and in the executive, right? I mean, they are all in various ways reactions to what was happening there. Okay, so that is as far as the, how does the second thing, as I said, is a change in the mode of politics, right? And that change in mode of politics, which I described as Caesarist or constituting a direct popular appeal. I do not want to use the term populist. We can discuss why later, but just bear with me to say that I feel that what happened there was an inauguration of a new mode of politics, where political parties, instead of becoming ways in which power is aggregated, simply become media through which the voice and personality of the leader are amplified to the public, right? So elections and the role of the party system itself starts undergoing a change, right? And I think that has been a very important thing. Indira Gandhi, of course, then subsequently relies on first Sanjay Gandhi and then Rajiv Gandhi to sort of carry forward. So Congress party itself becomes a kind of a family firm, which it has remained ever since. But again, this is a very sort of prominent feature of Indian politics as a whole. Don't think about national level politics, think about state level politics. Practically every state leader chief minister operates on this mode, where they have a direct connect. The cabinet, the party, etc., are there only to sort of project their image. And that most of these state level sort of political parties are also family firms, because they believe that that is the best way in which various aspects of charisma can be claimed and reclaimed and reinvented time and again, right? So that's the second sort of broad change which happens, which again we are living with, which is the sort of change in the mode in which politics operates. It's not the standard mode of party politics in any sense. Again, we can discuss whether it happens in many other places, etc. I think it is the case. The last kind of set of changes, and again, in some ways, which I think are at least as consequential as the political changes, are somewhat more it's more difficult for us to wrap our heads around, because we do not associate Indira Gandhi with those kinds of things at all. The typical way of thinking about what Indira Gandhi's economic policies is that they are all highly socialistic. They are kind of about increasing state control on the Indian economy, etc., etc. All of that is true, but it was true only for a limited period of time. The period when the state's sort of role in economic management was sought to be increased by a series of nationalizations, etc. I'll come to bank nationalization separately, but other kinds of things, is effectively from about 1969 till 1973. In 73, the government of India actually embarks on the nationalization of the wholesale trade of wheat. Yeah, they say the state is going to take over trading of the wheat. And that proves to be a total fiasco, because there is a lot of pushback from chief ministers of states, including Congress states, because once you start undercutting middlemen in agricultural trade, nobody's going to fund your electoral politics, right? I mean, at that point of time, those interests were very important in the way that Indian politics was structured. Secondly, all of that also coincided with the period of very strong inflation in 1972 to 74, which meant that provision of food at reasonable prices, which itself was a challenge, was getting much more aggravated by these sets of policies. So by about 1973, you could say that the peak of that so-called socialist kind of phase of Indira Gandhi's economic policy making is gone. In fact, from 1974, the trajectory is quite different. In 1974, she signs a loan with the IMF. But before the IMF loan is sort of concluded, Indira Gandhi actually uses the Indian Army to put down the largest strike in the history of independent India, which is the Indian National Railway Strike of 1974. Yep. That is done. Through that, a message is sent to pretty much of the organized working class that, listen, we will not tolerate very high levels of militancy, because all of that is seen as contributing to various forms of wage price spiral inflation. And then the IMF loan is signed. And the conditionalities of the IMF loan are actually pretty strict. If you look at the kinds of anti-inflationary package which is introduced in 1974, it is actually pretty strong. It's pretty much the opposite of what you would think of as any kind of socialist economic policy making. It's actually conservative macroeconomic management of the variety that the IMF favored at that point of time. And those are the same sets of policies that continue through the emergency. During the emergency, we also find that there is a debate within the government of India about how do we sort of restore production in the economy, which is something that they feel industrial production particularly is declining since 72. And that the answer to that is seen as more liberalization of controls. So a lot of the work in terms of economic policy making from 1974 onwards is actually fundamentally about unrolling the various kinds of controls that were imposed on the economy in the earlier period. Right? So what you have, therefore, is the movement of Indian economic policy making in the macroeconomic sense in a conservative way, in terms of liberalization, much more pro-business from 1975 onwards, right? And that is the trajectory that continues through the 1980s when Indira Gandhi comes back as well. In fact, those of you who are interested, there is a dinner which is hosted for Indira Gandhi after she becomes Prime Minister again in 1980 in Ashok Hotel in Delhi, and which Mrs. Gandhi actually attends. And her host there is a man called Dhirubhai Ambani. You can actually see the photograph on the web. Yeah. It's inconceivable that Indira Gandhi would have kind of even known Dhirubhai Ambani in 1967 or 1970, right? So the entire nature of the political economy, the relationship of the state and business, etc., is changing. Again, all of that was presented in the language of various kinds of socialism, self-sufficiency, autonomy, etc. But I think that vocabulary can be not so much, it is not there to mislead us, but it can be misleading if taken at face value, right? So that's the first thing. The first thing I think is that there is actually a trend towards moving towards liberalization, moving in a much more pro-business direction, which is pretty much the opposite of what Indira Gandhi's socialism is supposed to be. The other aspect of economic policy making, which I think has had at least as important consequences, was a very important shift in the Indian state's imagination of what constitutes development itself, right? So in the Nehruvian period, development was supposed to be about moving people from less productive activity like agriculture to higher productive activities like industry, right? I mean, it's a standard two-sector Lewis model, farm to factory transition, which is what was attempted through planned industrialization and other things. But from pretty much the end of the Nehruvian period itself, 1963-64, there is a sense that the challenge of poverty in India is such that this kind of an approach to assuming that development is the answer to poverty, that relative poverty and improvement of incomes, etc., is the way to go, is not going to work. What we need are more directly targeted programs for sectors which need support of sectors of Indian society, right? So that leads to an entire slew of targeted welfare programs, especially anti-poverty programs, which are rolled out from 1969 onwards, right? And the government is able to roll out those programs, not just because it has this new imagination of what constitutes development, which is that poverty is not a relative problem, but it's an absolute condition which has to be ameliorated. But that kind of a conceptual policy shift is accompanied by a fundamental change in the way that Indian political economy operates, which happens as a consequence of the bank nationalization story, right? Again, bank nationalization is one of those stories which everyone says, oh, bank nationalization was done for political reasons. Of course, that is true. But the consequences of bank nationalization were extraordinary. The entire infrastructure of the Indian state, financial infrastructure of the Indian state, is transformed. Because what the state is now able to do is extend bank branches, all of which are nationalized, into various parts of India, particularly rural India. All the savings which are then coming into the banking system, a very significant amount of them is taken up by the central bank through various kinds of reserve requirements. And the central bank then uses those accumulation of reserves in order to fund the fiscal deficit of the central government, right? So you had this entire new fiscal monetary machine which is constructed, which is what enables these anti-poverty programs actually to be operated. And I think that perhaps is the longest of the legacies that Indira Gandhi's time has left behind for us. I mean, if you just walk into, I mean, you just look at news of any day on any state of India, welfare schemes, targeted welfare schemes is what is the name of the game, right? Now we have many more instruments. We have direct cash transfers, but those are all only improvements on what is a fundamental idea which actually came up at that point of time. The idea that poverty is an absolute condition, that we have to identify who are people in need by something called the poverty line, which is actually a contraption again created in the 1960s. And then we have to find ways of actually providing programs and direct support to targeted groups, which is very different from the kind of Nehruvian model of planned economic development, right? And I think that is the India in which we live, the India of liberalization, of a market-based economy which runs principally oriented towards private enterprise, and coupled with this kind of an imagination of targeted welfare schemes. Now they are called rights-based, et cetera, but that is only a change in terms of its legal basis. But the model was all there. So these, I think, are the real legacies of Indira Gandhi. And as I said, one of the things which struck me when I was working on this book is that many of these were not things that she actually wanted to do. These were, in fact, things that were quite orthogonal to what she thought she was herself doing. But that is true of most powerful political actors as well. Their historical role and what they accomplish may actually be at a tangent to what their own self-conception is. So I think that is as true of Indira Gandhi as it is perhaps of people who are kind of currently in charge of India. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Thanks, Srinath. That was very interesting. And I mean, I think that the larger transformation that we talk about is really the engine that keeps this book going, even though it really dives into economic history, legal history, and all sorts of various interesting directions, but has a running through line. So we'll open up for questions, but let me just abuse my power as the moderator and plug in a couple of my questions. One is this idea of the transformation that is happening of this political system, and this doing away with norms on all sides, and the rules of the game and the accumulation of power and all that. It is very interesting that the actors in your book, it seems that they're throughout long 70s, they are pursuing all of this for power's sake. It seems like most of it is bereft of any serious ideological or political project attached to it. Of the debate seems to be about whether how to be in power and not about which direction India should go or something like that. And so we were talking about earlier as well about that even emergencies struck very surprisingly was very bereft of a serious political project. There were things that they said, but I mean, really, that now that we have this opportunity of this kind of power, what do we do with it? It's not like there's serious thought given to it. And so in that, I contrast with a lot of other these kind of transformations or this power struggle that has happened in other parts of Asia at the time, in China, in Korea, in Indonesia. But there's a serious, either before or post facto, there's a serious thought given to how we use this power to change where this direction of this country was going to something else. And so why do you think that, do you have a similar reading, and do you think that that's unique to India? And let me just plug in one more question, which is I thought that there was a very interesting dichotomy that came out in terms of two Indira Gandhis in the book. There's the traditional decisive Indira Gandhi who would just go for the jugular whenever, calling emergency, breaking party, and all that. But there's also an indecisive Indira Gandhi in there. There's the indecisive Indira Gandhi when it comes to economic policy. Even after 1974, if there is an embrace of pro-business ideas for pragmatic reasons, it's not like she embraces gives full-throated support to them. There's still this idea of socialism, but there's a waffling in terms of economic policy. There's not a serious attempt to go one direction. Similarly, this idea of even though there's emergency and all these ideas of creating a Gaullist presidential system, once people actually start talking about making her president for life and all sorts of things, she actually seems to be very uncomfortable and kinds of reins in some of these forces. So there's this hesitation at some level to go all the way. So what do you think, like, why in certain cases she ends up in one decisive and indecisive mode? Is it a structural thing that is bringing her to these different outcomes, or is it something that is part of her personality? I don't know. I mean, how does she end up in different approaches to different questions?
Right. So yeah, on the first question, right? I mean, were there alternatives? See, the interesting thing to me about this whole story of understanding how the rules of the game kind of are played out, right, is that, see, there were some actors like Jayaprakash Narayan, who whose kind of moral concern with what is happening in Indian politics is absolutely clear. I mean, in fact, he comes back into politics, after active politics, after a very long time, of doing Sarvodaya and other kind of work, precisely because he thinks that Indian politics is kind of descended into this cesspool of corruption and so on. But the problem is that Jayaprakash Narayan's own alternatives in some ways are also about undermining the rules of the game as they are constituted, right? I mean, so that is the issue. The issue is not so much about whether there were alternatives or not, but whether people gave enough thought to what it meant to reconstitute. Right? Same thing with Janta. See, they were clear that the 42nd Amendment and all the things that Indira Gandhi had bought during the emergency had to be undone. But what are the other things which needed to be done was something that they could never apply themselves to, right? I mean, and that is also part of the thing, right? So I think, yes, the whole question of alternatives and so on, but again, I mean, I should, caveat by saying that from the period after the emergency, there are a lot of alternatives which come out, particularly in the domain of what you think of a civil society and so on, right? I mean, that is the other kind of story. I only gesture towards those things. I acknowledge that those things happen, but my focus is more on the formal political system. So there are those things, right? Now, in terms of Indira Gandhi, see, again, I don't have a good answer to why she is this way or that. But there's something that, one of her principal sort of secretaries was the economist P.N. Dhar. So I had actually interviewed Dhar Saab when he was already in his 90s. And he told me that, listen, I mean, the thing about her was that whenever you had a discussion on politics or foreign policy, you could always make out that she is a master of that subject. With economic policy making, she never felt that comfortable. I mean, we would explain things to her, she would get it, she would ask for ideas, and so on. But politics and foreign policy, nobody needed to give her any advice. I mean, she knew what she really was. So I think all the instances that you're talking about are moments of political crises. And there, I think she was, I mean, whether for better or worse, often for the worse, more decisive, right? I mean, so I think that is there. But economic sort of this thing, right? And again, see, the one thing I will say is that unlike all the other political systems that you refer to, right? I mean, even during the emergency, there is a sense that the Indian system is still bound to a certain form of democratic representative politics. And that meant that the number of social interests whose, interests had to be taken is much more. I mean, just today, for instance, I was reading this op-ed just before we met by Arvind Subramaniam, who's a former CEA and others, saying how the power in India is highly overpriced for corporations, right? Saying that corporations are paying what are almost double the standard charges for any comparable things, and that this is being done simply in order to benefit Indian farmers and Indian middle class to get them paid. But that is the reality of democratic politics for you. That is how Indian politics is constituted. You cannot explain away those kinds of social interests and assume that there is some economic policy making which is going to go purely on the basis of saying, you know what, India has to straight away half the industrial power tariff, right? I mean, that's in which world is that going to happen? So it's not going to happen. And that, I think, is the constitutive function of democratic politics. Because see, the economic transformation of India happened alongside the adoption of a political system of representative democracy. And that intertwining of those two things is highly consequential. So that is why I think, say South Korea, China, etc., are not comparable. I'm not saying they're better or worse. Obviously, they've done much better in some ways. But this is a very central feature of the way Indian sort of economy and economic policy making is constituted.
It's interesting that you say, P.N. Dhar said that Indira Gandhi was interested in politics and foreign policy and not economics. And you hear the same thing about Jawaharlal Nehru. You think you hear the same thing about Narendra Modi.
I mean, there is a reason I think it's called the dismal science, right? I mean, so yeah.
Yeah, we'll open up questions now. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I came here after.
If you could just wait for the mic.
Came here after having read the FT review,
Right.
which I think misses the point, as most FT reviews on India or any features that they write. But Am I hearing correctly that you're saying that Indira Gandhi was sort of, she arrived at a certain circumstance? She was a creature of a circumstance? Because my read is, if that was the case, she still did not really achieve much, whether it was, poverty alleviation, whether it was the breakdown of institutions, whether it was corruption that happened. So what do you think is her legacy? Yes, the environment, inflation, Bretton Woods, etc., oil crisis. What is her ultimate legacy to us Indians?
No, as I said, I mean, in a sense, she came to power at a certain point of time, and I would agree with you. I think most of what she thinks she wanted to accomplish, I don't think she managed to, or at least. So the legacy is, as I said, often of things that she perhaps never really intended. But that's the way I think we should understand how political actors and their legacies operate. Legacies are not simply about what people want to do. Legacy is also what they end up doing, right? And what Indira Gandhi ended up doing was to change Indian politics in this way, in the post-Congress dominance phase, was to bring in a new way in which parties and political leaders relate to the people.
Largely negative?
Largely negative. I mean, you could think of it as negative or positive. I mean, I leave the sort of valency to you to decide, which way it works, right? I mean, I come from Tamil Nadu. I mean, Tamil Nadu politics is all about, this kind of what I describe as Caesarism, one way or the other. But as I said, the third thing is, her economic policies sort of things, right? I mean, and perhaps the one area where you could say that she had some clear intentions was around this whole poverty alleviation programs and stuff. That was actually her baby. And I think there we need to give her credit. I mean, despite what, I mean, it achieved nothing in a sense that it managed to transform the Indian state's imagination of how we think about a problem, which I think is not a minor accomplishment. And again, we can have an argument about whether that's a good thing. I personally believe that it is not, because I believe what has happened as a result is that, our entire imaginary of development itself has become constructed around this thing. And again, I'm not saying this from the perspective of saying, oh, people are being given freebies. I actually come from the other point of view, which is to say that part of the reason we do not have higher levels of formal employment, etc., in India is because we have not really taken that kind of project of development seriously, right? Whereas this has become the substitute, this thing. But again, this was an area where not only the Indian state's imagination changed, but I think entire global imagination on poverty alleviation changed in the 1970s, thanks to the Indian example. If you look at Robert McNamara's famous speech in, I think, 1973 in Nairobi, McNamara basically outlines what is Indira Gandhi's doctrine. He says the World Bank is committed to alleviating poverty through direct attack on poverty. That is what we're going to do. So in a sense, she anticipated that curve. And I think, and I showed this, despite what people said about her understanding of economic issues, the bank nationalization story. See, banks were nationalized because of political reasons. She wanted to show that she was very progressive. But in the weeks after bank nationalization, she actually takes a huge amount of interest in terms of understanding how this system can now be reconfigured. What do we do with the kind of power that we have? So again, that I would say that the entire machinery which came together at that point of time would not have come about if she was not there. I mean, hypothetically, imagine if Morarji Desai was prime minister at that time. I can be absolutely sure it would never have come. So in some ways, people do make a difference and a change. Whether it's positive, negative is for us to sort of, I suppose, evaluate in the light of what we think is important or not.
Let's bunch up a couple of questions.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, Karthik.
Great. Thanks, Srinath. That was great. Maybe can I bug you to talk about the foreign policy story now? I remember many years ago, maybe we had a conversation. It was a book by Daniel Sargent on the long 1970s and how that transformed the US's global role and foreign policy. Can you maybe talk a little bit about Indian foreign policy and the effects of the 1970s and what happened? I mean, within the region, in terms of nuclear policy, the relationship with the USSR. There was a lot that happened that we're still living with and India is still struggling with. So that's my first question. The second one, so the existing literature on reforms, right? And why and how that happened and liberalization is largely an endogenous story, right? I mean, you kind of reference Arvind Subramanian and there's Danny Roderick, Atul Kohli. I mean, others have written about it. I mean, it's largely endogenous, what kind of changes that were happening, within the Indian state and how they're experiencing different kinds of pressures. I mean, clearly you're broadening the frame, which is allowing you to see how international and kind of structural factors also had an effect. What did they miss that you have captured besides broadening the frame? Did you have access to any other materials? Is there anything else that maybe I think solidifies your case to make that broader structural explanation when, at least compared to the case that they're making? Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. No, great question. So on foreign policy, I mean, I must say, mea culpa. I mean, even though I'm supposedly a historian of Indian foreign policy, there's actually very little in this book on foreign policy, partly because I just felt that you couldn't pack in too many things. I think the broader global dimension, however, as I explained, is quite important, particularly the global economic energy crises of the 1970s and so on. In fact, I had, when the book was published, there was a former Indian permanent representative on disarmament, the people who deal with the nuclear weapons. He called me and said, Srinath, you have like one line on the nuclear test. I mean, how is that justifiable? I said, yeah, absolutely. I don't even have one line on Sikkim, right? I mean, which is even worse. So, but yeah, those were some choices. But, in a sense that I would say that the principal foreign policy kind of story as I see unfolding in this period is towards kind of more or less adopting a sense that, listen, there are a number of external pressures that are bearing down on India. Those are economic. Those are to do with the role of the superpowers, particularly the United States after 1971, but even before, but certainly after 1971. And that the key thing, therefore, is to be able to have a certain kind of ability to ring fence South Asia itself from these kinds of pressures, right? And that is why, for instance, she takes the assassination of Mujibur Rahman very seriously, because that's seen as kind of, in fact, there is a very interesting kind of an anecdote which Fidel Castro, recounts in an essay that he wrote on Indira Gandhi, where he says that on the day that Allende was assassinated in Chile, he was actually in India. He was traveling back to Cuba from Vietnam and had stopped in Delhi and was having dinner with her when the news was brought in saying that, President Allende has been assassinated. And he says that she told me, saying, Comrade Castro, this is my fate as well. This is what the imperialists want to do to me. So she had that very strong sense that, so a lot of the internal policy making was also driven by that kind of sense. And again, whether objectively that is true or not is a second order question, right? I mean, and how do we even say, for instance, there is a very interesting note that is prepared by M.K. Narayanan, who became National Security Advisor. He was, I think, he was the number 2 person in the Intelligence Bureau in 1973. And he talks about, all the various ways in which the Americans were trying to influence the Indian political system and so on after the 1971 war. And she says, Narayanan, everything that you say, nothing is very surprising to me. But my biggest concern is the weakness of our own domestic intelligence system, right? You guys are not like up to crack when it comes to actually. So she always had a sense that the existing apparatus was not strong enough, right? I mean, so a lot of the policy making, whether towards Sikkim, nuclear weapons, the way that she wanted to sort of deal with South Asia, or even the sort of rapprochement with China in 1975. I think all of that was designed to say that, listen, this is a period of maximum stress, and we need to have an ability to really batten the hatches and keep that up. So that's the way I read it. I couldn't write. I mean, I wrote, or rather couldn't put in too much of that into the book. So that is the thing. Now, on liberalization, again, I don't want to overstate the case, right? It's not as if we were already in the liberalizing mode from 1974, 75, right? What is important is that there is a gradually building set of ideas within the policy-making establishment of the Indian government, which say that we have to steadily move in the direction of removing controls on private enterprise. And 1975, I think, is a very good moment when things start. The people in charge believe that the emergency actually gives the government more leeway to do all of those things. So there is a gradual kind of thing. And, as Sandeep said, and I say this as well in the book, that there is no conviction on the part of Indira Gandhi that this is what we need. But this is what circumstances are forcing you to do. Because if you have to deal with the global economic crisis and its implications for India, then how do you restore growth, etc.? This is seen as the kind of answer. But I think that kind of a consensus is very important to build up, because otherwise, it's very unlikely that in 1989, suddenly one fine day we would have woken up and found that, there's actually a number of ideas about how to sort of remove all of these things and so on. There's another very important way in which this story actually relates to the liberalization story, right? So as I said, the bank nationalization allowed for the creation of a new kind of fiscal monetary machinery, which the government was able to use in order to fund its fiscal deficits, right? So the Indian economy has many problems in the 1970s, but fiscal deficit is actually not a problem. It is not a problem because of this machinery, which allows the government basically to, as they say, preempt a lot of the financial sector, right? To sort of take resources from there to fund its own requirements. Now, the problem is that by the time Indira Gandhi dies in 1984, you are operating at the limits of what is the level of financial cornering that the government can do. Between the nationalized banks and the national financial institutions like the Life Insurance Corporation of India, etc., something like 73% of their entire lending is to the government of India. Yeah. So the government of India actually is kind of running up against how much you can juice a system like this. So what happens under Rajiv Gandhi, it's not a period that I cover in great detail, but I did some research, I put it in the epilogue, is a turn towards external commercial borrowing. And that is what sets you up for the crisis of 1990. If you had actually not done that, I am pretty sure we need not have confronted the kind of crisis that we did. But at the same time, by 1990, and I'm not saying this in any conspiracy theory way, there were a lot of people within the system who were waiting for the crisis. They said, the next time the crisis comes, we're going to do all of these things, right? In fact, there was, for instance, a proposal in 1990 by Japan to give a soft loan of several $1 billion to extend the line of credit. The government of India actually said, no, we don't want it. Because there were a lot of people who felt that it's better to sort of bite the bullet now and do the changes that we need to change. So things did change, right? I mean, so in that sense.
Ivan, then Medha and Nishant.
Well, thank you for 2 hours. So thank you so much for 2 hours of a presentation. I have 2 questions. One question is, obviously the early 70s were the peak of Soviet influence in India. So how did it impact domestic Indian politics and economic policy making? Because it makes sense that there was a lot of influence, both in terms of the Communist Party and in terms of kind of planning and economic structures. That's my first question. And my second question is about the securitization that took place under Indira Gandhi with, for example, her special relationship with RMCAO, for example, the foundation of Rao, and kind of the securitization of many aspects of Indian politics. So how does this fit in this whole model? Is it a response to those subtle challenges? What type of response was it? And so on and so forth. Thank you.
Yeah. So on the sort of Soviet kind of story, right? I mean, again, see, it's interesting because the Soviet Indian relationship, even before 1971, I mean, I think the first draft of the Indo-Soviet treaty is proposed by the Soviet Union in 1967, right? And at that point of time, Indira Gandhi doesn't want to really go there. I mean, like, it's only in the context of the 1971 crisis that even 1969, when she's breaking up the Congress party, she decides not to sign it. And then 1971, they do. So it's a kind of a, circumstantially driven thing rather than something. And again, at that time, in even at the height of the crisis, of Bangladesh crisis, when the agreement with the Soviet Union is signed, Indira Gandhi actually tells P.N. Huxar that should we try and do something similar with the People's Republic of China? Huxar is actually taken aback. He says, listen, I mean, like, we can't. So in a sense, she doesn't see this as some kind of an exclusive relationship with the Soviet Union, as it were, right? One of the best sort of summaries that I have come across, when you read hundreds of foreign policy documents and then you come across someone who cuts to the chase. There's a former Indian ambassador to Singapore called Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, who came here, I think, in 82 or 83. Ambassador Dasgupta told me something which I think is absolutely correct in terms of how she thought about the relationship with the Soviet Union. He said, she called me and I said, Prime Minister, please tell me, what is my brief and what would you like me to do? She said, Shekhar, foreign policy is very simple as I see it. There are 2 superpowers in the world. One of them is much stronger than the other. So it is in India's interest to be closer to the weaker one, right? I think that is exactly the way that she saw it. That the relationship with the Soviet Union would come with far fewer strings attached and far lesser hostility than that with the United States. And I think that is the framework within which she operated the entire relationship with the Soviet Union and so on. So I think it was, in fact, in the early 70s, Indians were trying to get the Soviets to buy more stuff from India as part of the rupee ruble trade and other things. So it's not so much about transfers from the Soviet Union, but having a certain kind of a thing. Now, the securitization, R&AW and stuff, it's a very interesting question because it relates to this whole kind of strengthening of the executive branch that I talk about, right? Because the interesting thing about the R&AW is that it is, there are plans to sort of create it after the 1965 war itself, because the intelligence bureau is seen as having failed twice. First in the 1962 war, when their assessment suggested that the Chinese would not attack. And then in the 1965 war, when they actually did not know that Pakistan had a second armored division, which was constituted of Abrams tanks, which the Americans had given them, right? So the IB was actually on the back foot pretty much from 1966. And Kao, who was, an old IB hand, was then picked up to create this external intelligence agency. But what they had to decide was where that agency would be situated. So the Intelligence Bureau was situated in the Home Ministry. So now the Intelligence Bureau is stripped out of its external functions, which means it's a slightly weaker, attenuated agency, is retained in the Home Ministry. But the R&AW is put within the Cabinet Secretariat. A body of government which actually has very little to do other than simple coordinating functions. That's what the Cabinet Secretary presides over. And that effectively meant that R.N. Kao had direct access to the Prime Minister pretty much. So if you look at a lot of the documents from the 1971 sort of crisis, which was the first external crisis that the R&AW dealt with, you will find that there are notes which are prepared for P.N. Huxer, who is Principal Secretary to Indira Gandhi, by R.N. Kao, saying, I went to meet the Prime Minister and this is what she told me, and I'm just putting this on the record for your information. Right? So that is the way in which the executive sort of preponderance really comes into this. And which is why the Janata government, when they come to power in 1977, actually sort of, say that the R&AW was used for domestic political purposes, etc. They begin a certain kind of an investigation. And then slowly you realize that, if you are in the executive branch, you have some powers, you might as well use it, right? Why give things up, right? So that is the broad story. I mean, that's a story of preventive detention as well. Yeah, the Janata government wants to repeal the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, which they do, which is the sort of act under which a lot of people are put in jail without trial during the emergency. But at the same time, they also want to bring in a bill which brings in preventive detention. That's because people like Morarji Desai and all know that, listen, I mean, these things are useful, right? I mean, so it doesn't matter whether you're from which party. When you're in power, things are useful.
So this time we will bunch up 3 questions.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, maybe my answers are very long.
Medha.
My question is about economic policies, and I completely agree with what you're saying about the phase of socialist economy has passed, at least passed even before perhaps the early 1970s. I am wondering if one can, if this whole pro-business liberalization kind of, this willingness to listen to the IMF, this willingness to listen to economists who are advising her about being more pro-business, etc., can be traced back to 1966, the rupee devaluation, at which point she is happy to go with what Shastri wanted to do. And she goes and she actually says economics was a weaker subject. I will do what my advisors say. But when devaluation of the rupee takes place, that backlash against her is what she can't deal with. And then there's a shift. Can we trace this back to that episode and that experience that she had?
Yeah, no, I mean, sorry.
That's
Okay,
fine.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, Ganesh.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk and I'm beginning to read the book. It's wonderful. My question is more about, how you approached it as a biography. So what kind of challenges and dilemmas you faced? Because, there are at least three fairly decent biographies, Catherine Frank, Pupul Jaikar and Inder Malhotra. So was there a dominant narrative you were up against? That's one kind of question. The other is, the sort of issues about the personal and the public life, and the inner self, all of that. And then, you know, key episodes. Are there certain episodes you wanted to focus, certain episodes you wanted to leave out of the narrative? What about roads not taken? What about the cast of characters? How much, you know, attention to be given to the people who were in the inner circle, the cabinet, the kitchen cabinet, and so on. So if you could just tell us something about the backstory of the book, that'd be great. Thank you.
Nishant?
Thank you so much for a lovely seminar. It was really fascinating. I just had a question on civil-military relations. In that, do you see what is happening today, or the state of civil-military relations today? Does it have any origin, perhaps in what you would call the long 1970s? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah. So, Mehta, you obviously know about the rupee devaluation story much better than I do, and my account, in fact, kind of is derivative of what you have sort of written, and I think that was a very important kind of phase, but I think its importance also lay in a certain sense that perhaps she had been kind of led astray by her advisors, particularly L.K. Jha, who's an interesting person because at some level he is eased out, and she brings in P.N. Haksar. Haksar is an unusual choice for this, and this goes to Ganesh's question about cast of characters and stuff, because Haksar is a foreign policy person, right? He's an MEA official. He's never been in the central government in India. He's served outside the country for the most part. But the thing is that she knows him for a long time, not very well, but she knows him, and she knows that he's trusted and he'll speak his mind and will give her the right kind of advice. And Haksar is the one then who step by step kind of changes all of this stuff, right? But L.K. Jha is interesting because he's the governor of the Reserve Bank when the bank nationalization happens. And, they only tell him like literally 24 hours before the ordinance is going to be signed. So he is not very happy. But then she writes a letter to him saying that, I've heard that you're going to resign, and I hope you won't do it because we actually need your help, because I don't know what all of this really means, and you have to help us now come. So in fact, L.K. Jha is the one who writes a couple of long notes to her explaining how to increase the CRR, the SLR, all those things which I was saying. The entire machinery actually is just this thing. So I think what happens is that, as her confidence grows more in the advisors that she has. Similarly, I think, in 1970, when P.N. Dhar is brought into the MEA, into the PMO, he's an economist in Delhi School of Economics. Again, person with no policy making established in this thing, but is chosen by P.N. Haksar to be his successor. Totally unusual. And Dhar as an economist is also kind of pretty middle of the road. No radical credentials of any kind. But between Dhar and Sukhamoy Chakrabarti, they actually write some very interesting notes for her when she is, when all this global economic crisis and other things go up, right? In fact, there is one very fascinating note. It is somewhere in my file. I'll share it with you as well, where they actually write a very long thing. They say that we have written this note in the Marxist kind of language, so that all of your kind of party people who think of themselves as leftists can understand what we are saying. And effectively, the point is to say that even Marx said that you first need capitalism before you can get to socialism. Right? I mean, so the not just the kind of advice that she's getting, but who she trusts and how these ideas are kind of done. All of that, I think, undergoes a significant change. And as she feels more comfortable with the advisors and knows that they are people who are kind of giving her straight off the bat kind of advice, I think she's much more willing to go along with that. Similarly with B.K. Nehru, who again in the height of just before the emergency, in fact, he tells her, he says, your entire slogan is wrong. He says, Garibi hatao, remove poverty is wrong. He says, Utpadan badhao should be your slogan. You increase production. So in fact, that actually becomes one of the leitmotifs of the emergency 20-point program and so on. So I think there is a lot more to be done, but there is a lot of material. That gets to Ganesh's point. So Ganesh, this is not really a biography in a sense that it was not conceived of as a biography. It is not written as a biography. It is not entirely, even though she is the main protagonist, it is not that much. There are certain things that publishers often suggest to you are good things to do, including putting Indira Gandhi's name in the title. So, it would have been in the subtitle left to me, perhaps. But, these are the ways in which these things work. So this is not really a biography. In fact, I think that there is but you're right. I mean, there is a lot on the cast of characters. Particularly, I think what I was able to find through a lot of the newly available materials, not newly as in now already 10 plus years old. I've been working on this for close to 15 years. whether in the National Archives or in the Murthy private papers and various other things, is precisely the role of these various other kinds of advisors and so on, right? I mean, like, H.P. Kamath, for instance, had a very important, cameo role to play at the time of bank nationalization because he sent us some ideas based on what they were doing. And then he comes in as a railway minister in 1973. So there are all of these kinds of very interesting people who are interesting because they were able to sort of generate a set of ideas, debates. And what you understand is that she is not some kind of an anti-intellectual. I mean, she's not like a father, surely, but she's not some person who is, devoid of any interest in knowing this. She takes actually a lot of pains to get very diverse sets of opinions, understand what people are saying, and then she goes by her own instinct of what needs to be done, which I think is entirely fair given her position there. But there are, a number of episodes. For instance, I think, again, one of the things that people who have read the book have pointed to me is that why is there so little on Sanjay Gandhi? I was like, because there is so much on Sanjay Gandhi, otherwise in our public imagination, I just want to tell you that there was a lot more happening than just Sanjay Gandhi. So I had to make some of those choices, which frankly I would concede are perhaps not entirely the same, because I just wanted to give prominence to other things which were happening rather than things that we took for granted. So I think some of those are there. And there are still episodes which I don't understand, for instance. I don't have a very clear idea of why she decided to call the elections when she did. I mean, I do give an account based on the documentation that I've seen, but there is no smoking gun set of minutes of meetings or decisions saying that this is the reason we'll do this, right? I knew what is her build up to it, but I don't know what makes her tick at that moment. And she also seems the kind of person, who, unlike again Jawaharlal Nehru, her notes are not very reflective. She doesn't want to. It's more about the decision. It's more about, putting things across. Except on some things which really, I think she cared a lot about, like this anti-poverty program. She really cared about those things. So I think, you have to sort of, it came from a place of understanding that we are doing the green revolution, which is benefiting the big farmers. But that means that, there is a huge inequality which is coming up. These are people who are at the lower end of the economy. What do we do for them, right? I mean, she has that framework in her mind from the very beginning, which I think is something which is interesting as well. On civil-military relations, yes. I mean, again, the interesting thing about civil-military relations in this entire period is that, post 1971, of course, her own, position on these matters is pretty strong, unlike that of her father after 1962, right? The way the 1971 war is handled and won means that everyone recognizes that she is pretty much the architect of the victory, even though Manekshaw and others are made field marshal and stuff. In fact, there is an entire discussion in the files on giving him the rank of field marshal and so on, right? And she's very clear. So she's very secure. She feels that there is no problem, there is no threat. But at the same time, I think there are, significant continuities with the way civil-military relations operated in the Indian context, which is that the military is often given a lot of leeway when it comes to deciding operational matters and so on. And I think the most important example of that is Operation Blue Star. It is an operation which is actually sort of planned and conducted by the military in what can only be described as somewhat extraordinary ways. The army chief, Vaidya, comes and tells us saying, this is what we are going to do. He then goes and explains that plan to his Western Army commander, Sundarji, and others. And those people say this is not a workable plan. So Vaidya then comes back and says, we're going to do something else. And then when they actually go into the Golden Temple complex, they end up doing something entirely different. They end up using force at a scale which was not at all told to the Prime Minister. And her own response to that is pretty clear. She says in 1971, I never asked Manekshaw what he was going to do, so why should I do it now? Right? I mean, so I think there were some longer term continuities with the way civil-military relations operate, which is that within a broader political framework, the military actually has a lot of leeway. So when Prime Minister Modi, for instance, said that, we are giving them a free hand to decide in Op Sindoor, he's not incorrect. That is the way the setup is, which is contrary to this idea that the military is entirely subordinate to the political leadership and so. They are in a political sense, but in an operational sense, they actually have a lot of leeway and freedom of action and decision making.
Any other questions?
Speaking of characters,
Could you just wait for the mic?
I think they're just trying to record. Sorry.
Hi. Speaking of the characters behind the PMO and other things, I think it was H.Y. Sharda Prasad who said that by imposing emergency, Indira Gandhi made sure that it cannot be imposed again in India. So any thoughts on that? One. And two, I missed the first half of the talk. I do not know whether you have touched on it or not. So how do you see Indira Gandhi before and after emergency? Indira Gandhi as a prime minister and her PMO before and after emergency, because I think that there were a lot of changes in the so-called kitchen cabinet, P.N.dar, Deepidhar, Kao, H.Y. Sharda Prasad and others. So how was it different before and after emergency?
Yeah. So
Just a couple of things. One is when you mentioned that the election, the decision, the no smoking gun about calling elections, you meant the 1977 election.
77
And just to clarify.
Yeah.
Book is available in Kinokuniya. And we are also broadcasting it on Facebook Live, and we have a question from Facebook Live. So I'll just add that. Then as a question, internet, it is from Prasanjit K. Basu, and it's basically asking about the idea of stuffing courts with her loyalists, Supreme Court with the loyalists before 75 and the abolition of right to property. But I think speaks to a larger question as well about, I mean, this book, how do you imagine it placing, like, because I imagine a lot of people or some people would be incensed at the idea of this somehow justifying emergency or in some way appearing as justification of emergency. How do you think about that? The question.
Yeah. Okay. So on the justification of the emergency, see, I mean, as I said, see, it is very clear to me that Indira Gandhi imposed the emergency principally to secure her own prime ministerial office from the kind of challenge that she felt she was facing after the Allahabad High Court verdict, which set aside her election. She got some kind of interim relief from the Supreme Court, but the opposition was galvanizing the streets. So it was a move which was taken. And as I said, in taking that move, she did not, even though the emergency is routinely described as constitutional because there are provisions in the Constitution, there was already an emergency in place in 1975, going back to the 1971 war. This was the second emergency which was imposed. There was no such provision in the Constitution for a second emergency. And even the procedural requirements for how the emergency thing were to be given, a written recommendation from the Council of Ministers, the cabinet, etc., were all set aside. Which is why, in fact, I described the emergency in this book as a coup d'etat, which is what it was. You have to effectively thinking of it as a civilian coup. It is not some kind of a normal administrative measure which was taken in the way that she justified it, right? So I don't think there is any question of, but as I said, the pinning the blame on Indira Gandhi is not enough to understand how something like the emergency could have happened, because you had a political system which is construed on principles which are very different, where even provisions for doing this are given with certain kinds of safeguards. So the question then becomes, how did the emergency happen? Or rather, why was she not prevented from doing this stuff, right? That is the question. I mean, think of it. Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad, we all think of him, unfortunately, in retrospect, people get associated with this thing as some kind of a puppet. He's not. He's a senior congressman from Assam. He studied in Cambridge University. He's a call to bar in England, was Attorney General of his state, knew the law of the land as much as any other lawyer could have known. How much did it take him to sort of do that? Why does someone like him not do it? In order to answer that question, you have to do this. So what I say is that the changes which happened before that to the political system effectively meant that the conditions which were necessary to prevent such a thing from happening did not operate any longer. Those conditions had ceased to exist. It's very difficult to imagine how this thing, like say for instance, Morarji Desai also had a lot of problems with his president. There is an interesting set of exchanges that I sort of refer to in the book. And you can see that, presidents are not necessarily some sort of pushovers all the time. There was no reason for Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad to have done that. I mean, just to take one example, but there are many other examples. Why did the Congress party, the parliamentary party of the Congress party, have to give a resolution of all the MPs in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha of the Congress party got together and passed a resolution with only 30 people abstaining or voting in opposition, saying Indira Gandhi is indispensable for India? What does it tell you about the character of a party which can pass a resolution like that? It is only a party to which some things have been done in the years preceding. Yeah. So in that sense, so I don't think these are, how do you put it? I mean, even if you say that, she is culpable, that still does not do the job of explanation. The job of explanation requires us to sort of pay attention to these systemic factors and so on. Yeah. Now, again, your question about, before and after emergency, this thing. See, my own reading is that in her first phase, which you could say approximately from, say, about 1967 or 1968 to about 1973, 74, she actually had a lot of bureaucratic advisors who were, people who were people of caliber. Again, you could agree, disagree with the ideas that they proposed or what they suggested she should do, etc. But the one thing which was very clear is that the caliber of the people was very high. Someone like a P.N. Huxer, for instance, is a man of a very high caliber. Also very high integrity. In fact, the government of India offered him a Padma Bhushan when he sort of finished his term. He said, I will never take an award from the state. But the tragic part of the whole thing is that the same P.N. Huxer lies in front of the Allahabad High Court in order to protect the Prime Minister. He does perjury. Allahabad is the High Court to which he was called as a lawyer to the bar of Allahabad. Right? He then goes and tries to suborn all the judges of the Supreme Court, 5 of them who are sitting on the case after the emergency is imposed. Because she tells it. She says, you go and talk to them. He does it. Right? So this is, I think, the issue. The issue is not so much about the intellectual quality. It is more about what was it about their relationship with her that they felt that people of manifest integrity could actually end up doing things like that. Sharda Prasad, another good example. You are from Mysore, right?
Yeah.
So Sharda Prasad, again, I have some critical things about him in the book. Not because of that to single him out, but like for instance, there is a proposal which is made by Khushwant Singh on behalf of some senior editors after the emergency is imposed, saying that we will adopt a voluntary code of conduct, remove this pre-censorship regime that you have instituted. Sharda Prasad shoots it, saying that Khushwant Singh is a maverick. We need to have better ways of doing these things, etc. Right? So to me, that was something that was very striking. Whereas in the second phase, you had people of absolutely low caliber and who were entirely sycophantic. Right? So even the redeeming virtues of the first crew was not there. So let me say that much and leave it at that. Right? Sorry, was there another question?
No, I think I covered it.
I think we're done.
Yeah.
Right?
I think. Okay, the last question, we are way out of time, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I kind of took a lot more time upfront than.
You made a very interesting comment that leaders, and this is a study in leadership as well, that a leader's self-conception is often orthogonal to what he or she ends up doing. So in your study of Indira Gandhi, I mean, do you have some reflection on why this happens? Just your thoughts. Thanks. And thanks for a very enriching talk.
Yeah, no, thanks. See, I don't think there is one invariant explanation for why that happens. But I think that is the standard kind of relationship between, what in the jargon of the social sciences you will call as the agency of the individual or individuals concerned, and the kind of structures and systems within which they have to operate. Right? In fact, I have a quote from a person who's not often quoted called Friedrich Engels, who wrote a letter to a person called Bloch in 1890, where he says, one of the interesting things about politics particularly is that no one gets what they want. And what we eventually get is something that no one wanted, right? And he says that is because that's how the arithmetic of the sort of conflicting interests usually seems to resolve itself. As a result, history in retrospect always appears to be something which is not intended by any one particular person. And I think that's a pretty interesting way of thinking about that. And I think that is the way that I ended up seeing the kind of role that Indira Gandhi played in a book like this. And I think it's a useful reminder that even the most powerful political actors in a system will not always get their way, because there are other kinds of factors and considerations and pressures, some of which may be under their control, other may not be, and in certain cases attempting to control them may also make things worse, like the emergency and so on, right? I mean, so I just feel like some of that kind of misdirection between intentions and outcomes is more or less part of maybe human condition itself, but certainly in terms of politics.
Thank you, Srinath, for an excellent talk. And thank you, everyone, for a very interesting discussion.
Yeah. No, thanks so much. Yeah.
And with this, we conclude the meeting.
Thanks, Sandeep.
Thank you.